Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are the program on education policy and governance here at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Antonio Wendland. I'm the Associate Director. I wanted to just go quickly through a couple of things for everyone. These proceedings are being recorded and they will be posted on our websites. We will be adding high quality captioning and they will appear usually the Monday after the weekend. We do have two ways to interact. Please keep in mind, we have a chat open for everyone to talk and express their opinions, but we also have the Q&A panel open where people can ask questions. And a reminder, questions always end with a question mark. If you put your questions in the Q&A, it will be easy for us to find them. We'll be able to integrate them into our discussion after the presentations. I would like to now introduce our program's director, Professor Paul Peterson, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government. Paul?
Thank you, Antonio, and welcome everybody to the penultimate session of the conference, Should School Boards Run Schools? We will be having one more session 1 week from today, but today we're focusing on the topic, how can school boards navigate the culture wars? As you all know, there's been a lot of debate over the content of curricula, whether or not we should approach the slavery issue and the segregation issue in American society one way or another. And there's been a lot of debate over the gender issues that have been constantly changing before our eyes. So these are the topics that will probably play a major role in our discussion today, but there are other cultural questions, other questions of how you navigate debates among various groups in society if you're on a school board. So these will be the topics that we want to explore today. Now, to introduce everybody, I would like to turn the podium over to Michael Hartney, who is a professor at Boston College and a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. So, Michael, would you introduce our panels today?
Great. Thank you, Paul. I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists today, starting off with our main speaker, Andy Rotherham. Andy's co-founder of Bellwether Education Partners, which is a nonprofit that works to transform schools so that all students can achieve outcomes that lead fulfilling lives and flourishing communities. Andy also serves on the Virginia Board of Education, and he has been appointed to and served in senior policymaking roles by both Democrats and Republicans, including a tenure in the Clinton White House. Next on deck, we'll have Max Eden. Max is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on K-12 and early childhood education reform. Max has authored numerous reports, studies, and opinion pieces that touch on many of the subjects that we'll discuss today. In particular, of late, he's written on issues directly related to how school districts and educators should address issues related to race, DEI, and gender in the classroom. And finally, we have Scott Levy. Scott currently serves as president of the Westchester Putnam School Boards Association. He's been a school board member. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Center for Education Policy Research, or CEDAR, at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for putting on this entire symposium. They've been really great to listen to, and you all brought in some interesting people and some great conversations. So I appreciate that. It's great to be with you all and see you again, Paul. So look, during the introduction, as I said, this is actually my second time I'm a State Board of Education member in Virginia. I was appointed by Mark Warner, and then I've been subsequently appointed more recently by Glenn Youngkin, who reached out and wanted to know. We're working on some accountability and learning loss stuff, and I'll talk about sort of navigating in that context, but I feel like I should put that out. So I've seen this from different perspectives. I will talk about that. I mean, a lot of people probably argue being a state board member twice, any kind of board member more than once, means I'm a slow learner, and there might be something to that. Look, I'm a believer in this stuff, that these systems and processes can work even when it's messy. And I should note, like Bellwether, where I work, my day job, we believe in that too. I mean, we do work on governance. We recently merged with Education Board Partners, and so To cut to the quick, sort of on the broad question, can they navigate these things? Yes. And can school boards work? I think yes. I mean, there's obviously plenty of examples of how to do it badly, but I think overall my answer would be yes. But on this, I want to start with just a couple of contextual points, and then I know Paul has some questions, and I'm going to share an example from Virginia that I think illustrates where we are. Let me just start by, I mean, first of all, I think a major problem we have, social media messes with our sense of prevalence. The media and the way they cover things messes with our sense of prevalence. I mean, all this week, everybody saw, I think it was in Glendale, California, where you had, physical altercations erupting outside a state board meeting. Meanwhile, around the country, state board meetings happened all over the country. There was nothing like that, including state board meetings where they were taking on contentious issues. And in the way that the media operates right now, and in the way the social media obviously operates, our sense of prevalence gets completely distorted on things. And so we have to remember most boards are working, they're quietly doing their work. You don't have the stuff that we hear about in the news. Most teachers are not out there indoctrinating kids either from the right or the left. They're just trying to do their job. But when someone goes over the line one way or another, we're going to hear about it now. And that's been sort of the story that you certainly see in Virginia. Any sort of ridiculous policy that someone gets in their mind to pass, or some bozo lesson that goes on, it gets ricochets all over social media, and it creates a perception that this is happening everywhere. And that is really influencing the school board debate. And I think we have to, I apologize. Sorry about that. And I think we have to remember, like airplanes, you don't hear about the ones that take off and land just fine. And so there's a problem with the sense of prevalence. And you see that, look, that's not just, we see that when we talk about school shootings. We see that when we talk about police shootings. We see this across a host of issues, like a real overstatement of what's going on. I think that's the first problem with how we talk about school boards. We're overstating the extent of the problems. That's not to say there aren't problems, but we're overstating it. And you see, like, some of this is just definitional. So, for example, book bans are not nearly as common as you would think from some of the rhetoric, because we have these sort of expansive definitions of what constitutes a book ban. Are there books being straight up banned? That, yes, there are, and I have concerns about that. But a lot of what is being reported as a book ban is other things. We see that obviously with school shootings. We have very loose definitions of what constitutes a mass shooting at a school that understandably gets people concerned, but is a lot of events that are, while not acceptable or not, I think what a parent would think of as a school shooting. So I think that's the first thing. And look, we see this, and this, I'm going to talk more in a few minutes. People also completely, because of media and social media, overstate the views of their opponents. People are much more likely to think that their political opponents want to resort to violence than they actually do. They overstate their views. Well, we can talk more about that. As I said, I've got a resource I'll share, but you ask conservatives what liberals think about the country, and you get views that way outstate what progressives and liberals actually think about the country, and vice versa. If you ask liberals and progressives about conservative views, they way overstate certain things. So that's the first sort of big contextual point. The second one, as I said, I think boards are necessary. I think they're necessary. You have to have a democratic connection to schools one way or another. I may be unimaginative in thinking about sort of other ways, but I actually see a lot of this. This is just, the messiness is the byproduct of democracy. It is part of it. And we're talking about culture war stuff right now because that's what the media is focused on. But a few years ago, school boards were up in arms about Common Core. If you've done this work long enough, you can remember when everybody was up in arms about math. We've been episodically up in arms about reading. So this stuff sort of happens right now. The thing we're focusing on is this, and I'm not going to defend every board. Are they all optimal? No. I mean, you can probably put me in the camp. I think Mark Twain was probably onto something, but like in general, I think a lot of what we're seeing is just a byproduct of the messiness of democracy. And you can't miss, like, even with schools of choice, charter schools and so forth, some of the things that concern us about school boards, you end up seeing those same things play out on smaller school boards, just on a smaller scale. And so we have to ask ourselves, is it something about like different school boards, or is this something more just about when people come together in a governance arrangement, that there's trends and so forth that we see. The third contextual point, look, people just want normal. And that's what strikes me. The people who show up at a board meeting and so forth, they are there because they have strong opinions about something one way or another. Most people, they just want normal. And this is speaking for myself, I would say when I look across the landscape, you see some people out there who probably just need to join the rest of us here in the 21st century in terms of what kind of an inclusive society we're going to have. And then conversely, you've got some people who are trying to foist sort of ultra progressive politics onto schools in ways that are inappropriate, but that is not where most people are. And the resource, and I'll put it in the chat, we put out a deck at Bellwether recently called Common Ground. And what it just showed is this whole debate is being dragged by the fringes on both sides. What most people want is normal. They want, they're comfortable with inclusion. They're comfortable with respecting people who are different. They don't want ideological agendas of various kinds put on them. And a lot of what's animating the big debates is these sort of more extreme politics. And the last contextual point from where I sit, both sides want the fight, and they want the fight too much. And they want the theater. I've got plenty of issues with Moms for Liberty. I don't like everything that Parents Defending Education does, but to sort of label those groups as hate groups, as happened the other day, I mean, that's a publicity and fundraising stunt. That's not a substantive issue. Conversely, putting Chris Rufo on a governing board for a university, you're trying to make a political point there. That's not about sort of how do you do governance. And both sides like this stuff, and that's part of where we are. So look, is it hopeless? As I said, I don't think it is. We just went through a process in Virginia on developing our history standards, which obviously you want a culture war issue, history and social science standards are where you're going to get it right now. And I take a couple of lessons from that I will share. I would argue, and obviously, like, I'm a Virginian, so of course I'm going to say this, I would argue that right now they're probably the best in the country. Other people are going to disagree, and you can find different states and say their treatment of different things. But I think they're excellent content standards. They're not vague. They're not, they tell teachers what's the content that needs to be covered. It's clear what could be assessed and so forth. That was actually the key debate. The big disagreement in Virginia underneath everything was how much we should have content standards or how much we should have sort of quote unquote inquiry standards. And if you want a good example of the inquiry ones, Washington, D.C. is going through a standards process right now. I would look at theirs and you can see those standards are light on content, heavier on inquiry. A lot of people, and I'm not just talking about sort of Edie Hirsch, but a lot of people across the education community think that if those standards are vague, they're not actionable, they're not usable for teachers. I'm one of those people. I think teachers need, what is the clear content and so forth that's going to be covered. This was cast as sort of a left-right thing, but it's not. In many ways, it's a left-on-left thing in terms of the politics around content and standards. I mean, Don Hirsch has been portrayed as a conservative for years, but he's anything but. But this was all cast as left-right, and this was actually the core issue: was are we going to teach content or are we going to do sort of inquiry, which leaves teachers to fend for themselves. That was the big debate. The standards themselves are excellent. They talk about the amazing things that this country has done recently in terms of progress against diseases, progress in space, our progress on things like civil rights, historically, World War II, things like that. They also talk about everywhere this country has fallen short in very straightforward terms. I think, I could be wrong about this, I think we're the only state that has a clear standard on teaching about causes of the racial wealth gap. We teach about civil rights, the successes and where we've fallen short. We teach about Virginia's history there, particularly in depth, which obviously every state's not going to go into the level that we go into on Virginia. They're excellent on all that. Nonetheless, you have people running around still saying they're whitewashed. I mean, for the first time, we don't teach in Virginia that there were multiple causes of the Civil War and this kind of thing. We teach very clearly slavery was the proximate cause of the Civil War. Again, like the stuff I just talked about, we teach about Reconstruction. We teach about the period of racial terror following Reconstruction, not just Jim Crow, but in much more depth. And yet you got a lot of people running around still saying, oh, they're whitewashed. Like, first of all, I can tell you they haven't read them. But second, like, that's just sort of the conflict entrepreneurialism that's out there. And likewise, we have people who think we focus too much on those things. You're not going to please everybody. But the big lesson is it's tribal and you can't try to. What you have to do in these roles, if you want to have a successful board, it's not about winning an argument, like all the stuff we put out. I can look at the download rates and then you can look at the rate of comments. Nobody's reading this stuff. They're operating off of whatever they're hearing on Twitter. You can't let that drive you. You can't try to win an argument. People are going to say plenty of stuff that's plainly at odds with the facts. You have to focus on getting things done. And what was fascinating to me about the Virginia experience is as soon as we were actually in agreement, we had some issues. There was a draft that the board rejected unanimously because it had a lot of problems. The final version incidentally was adopted unanimously. So it shows you can get there. But once we were moving towards, it was clear it was going to be unanimous. The board wasn't at each other's throats and so forth. Everyone kind of lost interest and moved on. It was about theater, not about substance. And one group, who I will give credit to, the ASCD chapter in Virginia, sent a letter to the board and said, hey, like, we were concerned about this. We expressed our opposition. In the end, you all did a good job, and we want to congratulate you. Everybody else, the caravan had moved on to whatever the next thing to be outraged about. And you have to make your peace with that. That's politics. And my sort of unique lens on this is when I was on the board for Mark Warner, the whole game was the Republicans trying to stop Mark Warner because he was emerging as a potential presidential candidate and building a national profile. And so everything was stop Warner. Now everything's stop Youngkin. The roles are all reversed, but it's the same thing. And if you want to have an effective board and navigate the culture wars, you can't get caught up in those politics. You just have to keep going. And then the final thing is, look, you have to remember these are public schools. And I think people forget that in different ways. And they forget that if you think that it's really important to teach certain kinds of content to kids in grades K through 3, you are forgetting that these are public schools. And if you think that kids in high school shouldn't be learning about discrimination, racism, tough aspects of our history, you're forgetting that these are public schools. And we had a really interesting example that I'll just share. How do you teach about the flag? And one of the suggestions that was given to Virginia from a set of modeled standards was you teach kids in the early grades to respect the flag. Well, that's a First Amendment issue. These are public schools. We cannot force a kid to respect the flag. We cannot force their family to. That's just a core First Amendment issue. We can, however, teach about ways people show respect for the flag. How military officers and military enlisted personnel show respect for the flag, how people doff their hat, why during certain rituals people stand or put their hand over their heart for the Pledge of Allegiance, things like that. We can teach all about that. And that's kind of where we landed, but it's a really good example of where we are talking about public schools. They are pluralistic institutions, and you can't lose sight of that. And one of the things that I think the sort of folks on the right and the left who are really into these culture wars, one of the things I think they have in common is they've lost sight of that pluralism and so forth. So look, appoint good people, don't appoint conflict entrepreneurs, don't appoint people who are gonna who sort of have a taste for the theater. Would be one of my hows, and my other 3 would be, you got to be responsive to the public, not to special interests. The views of activists are way out of whack, right and left. I can give plenty of examples, are out of whack with where people are. Again, that pluralism point, you hold a public trust, and you got to remember you're talking about public schools and approach it that way. And then finally, you got to be focused on the results, not the narrative. If you're worried about sort of changing minds or what people are going to be saying on social media and stuff, you're not going to get anything done. I think as soon as our standards got focused on what can we get done to have, the governor charged us with, he wanted to have the best standards in the country, teach the good and the bad. As soon as that was the North Star, and that's what we were focused on, we delivered that. And so I do think, like, if in 2023 you can deliver a set of standards like that, and don't take my word for them, lots of other people, like we can talk about that, have validated that, then I think it shows that the answer to the question is, can you navigate the culture wars? Yes, it's not easy, and it takes people being adults, but it's certainly doable. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions. I hope I didn't go too long, but that's the view from I've served 2 sentences on state boards, and that's the view from here.
All right, thank you, Andy. We're actually going to go through all 3 speakers, and then we'll begin the Q&A. So Max, if you would.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for having me. And I appreciated Andy's contextualizing remarks. There's one that I think is very useful, and there's one that I kind of want to push back on. What I think is very useful is just the reminder that social media isn't necessarily a reality, that as we look at the culture wars over the country, we look at it primarily through the lens of what happens to pop on Twitter, what happens to pop through media websites, which have a very active interest in stoking controversy. Where I think I disagree with Andy is the degree to which our focus on it is driven by decisions made in the media, or actually reflects something that is really, far deeper that's happening in our country. And this iteration of the culture war seems to me to be different from past iterations. It's a case where America's elite class has adopted kind of fundamentally new, different truth claims about matters related to American civilization, to race, to sex, to gender, over the past 10 years. And the acceptance of these truth claims is largely still confined to a rather kind of elite set of activists, as Andy had indicated. However, these activists have a disproportionate influence over our public education system, right? This new set of views is reflected by the NEA, the AFT, the AASA, National School Psychologist Organization. All of these organizations around public education have gone all in on what's commonly known as either anti-racism or CRT, or gender identity, gender ideology, right? These are things that 10 years ago, I think most elites would have agreed that colorblindness is the American aspiration. It is what we should all teach our children. It's what we should all strive for. As I am in more kind of elite rooms lately, that's actually not taken for granted at all. It's actually challenged without any counter challenge, right? That we must be race conscious. We must teach our children to be race conscious. And instead of viewing kind of America's legacy of racism as something that we can get through by kind of social and policy measures, it's perceived to be something that is unarticulatable, cultural, and kind of inherent in the individual. And so you have this mentality, this ideology that goes by the word anti-racism that's promulgated by Ibram X. Kendi, where you can either be a racist or an anti-racist in any given moment with any given opinion, depending on the extent to which you agree with progressive orthodoxy. And to the extent that I've seen controversies about race in public schools, I've been looking closely for years. I haven't seen that many local controversies over how slavery is taught, over how segregation is taught. Most of what I see is over what's called DEI, which is the importation of this kind of Kendian ideology into some segment of the public education system. The other major thing that has happened very recently, is the rise of gender identity theory, gender ideology, what have you. 10 years ago, this was an almost entirely unthought of and unknown phenomenon. These days, we have polls suggesting that up to 20% of Gen Z identify as LGBTQ. There are two interpretations to this, right? One is that children have always been this queer, as they say. The other is that there's actually a social contagion effect going on with it. And schools have to make a choice in how they address it, because gender identity ideology presents a kind of a truth claim, a fundamental metaphysical truth claim about the human condition, that there can be a gendered soul that is distinct from the physical body, that is owed moral deference upon declaration and by compulsion by all people. And this is an area where I really strongly don't agree with Andy that's kind of confined to a small group of activists or limited to a small set of school districts, because as of the last count made by Parents Defending Education, which is still a very incomplete count, we see 10 million students attending school districts who have a policy of socially transitioning children without telling their parents, right? And this is a case where I think public opinion on this is close to 80-20, 75-25 as to whether it's appropriate for a school to hide information about a child's gender identity from their parents. And yet it has become common practice in about a fifth of schools, and will soon be pushed upon all schools by the Biden Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. So what we're seeing play out as the culture war is a kind of a set of frictions and conflicts as a new set of lead opinions kind of cascades over institutions that theoretically should be locally democratically accountable, but frequently in practice are not. To the broader question of this panel, can school boards navigate it, and should they? The answer is absolutely yes. Schools are and should be transmitters of not only academics, but also kind of cultural intuitions and a cultural inheritance. And that should primarily be something that comes from local decision-making bodies. It should not be something that, can sway over the course of 5 years based on the vicissitudes of lead opinion. It should sway over time based on what parents actually want. And school board members, as Andy suggested, should operate primarily with an eye towards what the people who elected them think, what the kind of the normal people in their community think, and to try to make their schools culturally reflect the ideas and assumptions of their communities, rather than get caught up in what is frequently a kind of a status agonizing conflict where there is one set of new opinions that is perceived as the now only moral set of intuitions to hold, And what most people tended to think 5 to 10 years ago is readily labeled as bigoted upon within circles that exert a lot of social pressure on people in the education sphere. So school boards are kind of the only place where this can be resolved kind of sanely and with respect to the wishes of the community. And to the extent that it can be, I think that we might see this diffuse over the next few years as Andy has suggested, kind of, I think, certainly privately and publicly, that this will kind of normalize to a certain stasis point within the next 5 to 10 years. I certainly believe that it could if the local democratic responses actually keep in line with the wishes of the community, or it might not if, as Michael Hartney has documented, kind of off-cycle school board elections lead to non-democratically accountable school board members who view themselves as more beholden to the whims of American elites than to their own communities.
Scott?
So thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate the series that you've done. It's such an important topic, and you've been able to shed light on it. I want to start by talking about a few concrete examples of how boards at the local level, at the district level, can navigate this particular set of issues, and then also at the end some macro thoughts to put it all in context. And I too share a positive view on a board's ability to do this and do this very successfully, but it's not easy. I think the first point to make is that it's important for boards to understand like what precisely the people in their community might be angry about. And Andy spoke about the media and the prevalence issues, and I think the media is an important driver of this because newspaper ad revenue, if you look a decade ago, was $70 billion in this country. We're down to 20 billion. So many newspapers across the country have either reduced staff or closed. And local coverage of school board issues is just not what it used to be, 1, 2, 3 decades ago. So people end up getting much of the news from the internet and from cable news on TV. And so you see the national news, but that doesn't necessarily link to your local district. On the internet, some of the information is very high quality. Some of it could be potentially misleading. So it's important to take a step back and say, like, what are the issues and is there some misunderstanding in a community, or is everybody on the same page? And yet there's disagreement, which obviously could be the case as well. In addition to the flashpoints that we see on the news all the time related to whether it's CRT or some of the gender issues, there are many other issues that are true board policy issues that have come under intense debate. That could be magnet school admissions policies in various cities or counties across the country. The concept of having accelerated coursework that is highly divisive in communities. Some people emphatically believe, yes, we need to have accelerated math, and others believe no because of the equity issues. SROs and whether there should be a police presence in schools, school disciplinary policy. I mean, the list goes on and on. So I do believe there are a lot of these issues, and they do crop up in many communities across the country. But it's important to be all on the same page. The second piece is whether or not if you have individuals at a board meeting or in your community that are expressing some discontent, do they represent the majority of the community or not? And in my old career, I was an investment banker, and one of the things that I always think about is with corporate boards, they're shareholder activists. They may own only 5% of the company, but they have a loud voice, and they are very public in terms of expressing their opinions. Sometimes their opinions match the entire shareholder base, and other times they do not. And the same thing is true here. If you have a few loud community members speaking at a meeting, it is sometimes hard to know whether or not they're representing the community. And it's important to know your community well so that you can do the best job you can to figure out what the feeling is in your community. The other issue that I think crops up is oftentimes boards get presented with matters that at least initially should be dealt with in school buildings by teachers or by administrators and go up the channel. If they're policy issues, that's a different story. But if they're very specific classroom issues, educators who are trained to think through pedagogy and think through content are sort of the first line of discussion with parents. And then to the extent that a parent is unsatisfied, of course, they have every right to ultimately bring it up to the board. And then the last piece is just trying to build trust in the community, because I think having different points of view, it's very American and very natural, and we should expect it. I think what has happened, though, is that there's this erosion of trust around all institutions in America, everything from higher ed institutions to the federal government to local school boards as well. And when you have distrust, then you jump to the worst conclusion. We saw this around masking during the pandemic. where some believed that if you put a mask on every child, that you're going to, have you're trying to kill them, and then other people that wanted, mask optional approaches were viewed as being very selfish and not caring about kids that may have high health risk. And just that mindset of just being so distrustful of viewpoints on the other side, is not a great way to ultimately build trust and have a positive outcome. And there are just lots of ways to do this, including involving the community in different committees or different roles, bridging with the PTA, explaining very clearly the role of the board versus the role of the state, which, let's face it, sometimes that goes to litigation because it's a murky line, but sometimes the board isn't even responsible for a particular issue, and it might be at the state level, but yet people come to the board to ask the board to make a change that they're not illegally empowered to do, and just generally having community connections. In terms of the macro thoughts, just a few there. First off, I think that on the one hand, I think there's a lot of sort of negative connotations around all these things that are happening in boardrooms, but I view it differently. I think that in a way, we should all be thankful that parents deeply do care and that they are engaged in the process of their child's education. That is a good thing. Oftentimes we may not agree with one opinion or the other, but I think that general thought process that we want parents involved is a positive. And school boards are the best way to do that, just given that they're on the ground. You can go look people in the eye and go to public comment period, and everything is quite transparent. The second piece is when you look at history, I think that in my view, actually, we're not in that different a stage than we have been at different points in history. In Philadelphia in the mid-1800s, there were literally outbreaks of violence and fires happening and churches on fire over the Bible wars and what Bible would be permissible in public school. We saw, I've seen quotes from the early 1900s that look exactly like a COVID quote, but yet they were about the smallpox vaccine and mandates in schools around smallpox vaccines. So we've seen these things come up time and time in American history. It's just part of the overall process. And then the last piece is, I think that we have two choices. We could either have these debates all at the state level or at the local level. And what I would argue is that obviously some things are going to be done at the state level, but that local discussion for every community to work through some of these issues is very important. And I think we've seen blue states and red states be quite activist around all these issues. Blue states, churning out mandates, and red states churning out various bans. And rather than having these state legislative mandates, I would much rather see boards engage with their administrators who are professionals, as well as parents and the community at large, to really try to navigate these issues. So that's just some high-level thoughts on both some tactical approaches and then just putting it all into context.
Well, thank you, Scott, for that set of observations, and thanks to all the panelists for a multidimensional conversation here. And I'm having trouble finding exactly where to begin, but I sort of hear two different views out there. One view is that local school boards are a democratic institution. They're elected boards in most parts of the country, that they're responsive to their community, but there are these small groups of advocates on one extreme or another, or probably on both extremes, who may have vested interests for why they are stirring up trouble and raising kinds of issues. And boards have to sort of not pay too much attention to them, but sort of manage them. But they are quite responsive to the community, and they're doing a pretty good job of navigating the culture wars. That's one point of view that I'm hearing. The other point of view I'm hearing is that that the school boards are really being too much influenced by elites in the society, that elites have decided that there's a new way of thinking about race relations that hasn't been taught in schools before, and we need to do something different about it. We have to go back to 1619. We have to go back to the depth of the slavery problem in America and how it has pervaded all aspects of our society and cannot be shrunk, and that should be taught in our schools, and that rethinking about the place of gender and the relationship between gender and sexual biology is now being rethought by elites, but hasn't been accepted by the masses. And yet the school boards are being expected to impose the elite culture on the community. So let me go back to all of the panelists and say,
which of these two views has it right? They're really very different points of view. Which of these two views do you think it has the story correctly stated? Andy?
I would say both or neither. And I think the problem here is like we tend to get into this. It's got to be tribal, one or the other. I think you can find the two views you laid out, Paul. I think you can find examples of both of them. My point was not that none of this stuff is happening. I think there is activist capture in some places. Like I don't disagree with everything that Max said. My point is simply our view on the prevalence of it in different places and so forth gets distorted. So I think it's both of those things, and we tend to, on a lot of these questions, the answer tends to be it's going to be both. It's going to be some of each. Max posited a question about LGBT kids, and is it that we're just simply seeing a social contagion, or is it that society's become more accepting and inclusive so people are more comfortable? The answer is probably both. There's probably aspects of both going on when you look at the data, but our politics force you to pick one side or the other. And I think one of the things that's worth getting into here at some point is just how much, and you see some of this among board members and you see some of this among the public, just how much preference falsification is going on because this is an elite argument. And again, you see that on both sides. You see it on the right, preference falsification around views on LGBT. Actually, people are more oriented towards being inclusive than the data would show. Todd Rose has done a lot of work on this. And on the left, like the policy Max mentioned about sort of schools secretly transitioning kids, wildly unpopular, but a lot of people are reluctant to sort of publicly say that. But it's a wildly unpopular, and it's an untenable policy that we're going to sort of evolve and move past, I suspect. So I think that's a problem here. I'm taking a little bit of issue with the premise of the question, because I think find a specific board and we can talk about what's going on. I can find you boards where I can show activist and elite capture for sure, and I can find you boards where they're trying to be responsive and navigate on some hard questions. I do think at some point we should talk about some of the structure issues. There are issues, I think, with how board members are elected, with when the elections are held, how those work. There are things we could certainly do to actually make these boards more small d democratic. We could talk about that. And then also, like Scott got about sort of people coming. One thing I worry about that I've seen is the participation at school board meetings. The social media is not helping. People are there. It's part of these larger things. And I do think that is getting in the way of, it's a First Amendment right, and people should come, I think, no matter what. But I do think we need to figure out, how do you make sure there's space for the people who, there's an issue on the agenda that they really want to talk about and is pertinent. They're getting lost sometimes in sort of just these larger atmospherics where it's big national issues getting grafted on. So I hope we have a little time to talk about, like, what are structural reforms that we could undertake here for boards?
Max, do you have a comment on?
Yeah, I tend to lean towards the latter of the two interpretations that you posited. The interpretation that school board members are generally, as a class, disproportionately captured by school activists, and it's kind of that activist ideology. Partly because, as Andy was suggesting, there are just kind of massive structural factors that would logically militate them towards that, right? When school board elections are held off cycle, when there's 4 to 6% turnout, when the turnout is primarily conducted as an operation by the teachers union, and when the teachers unions have articulated very strong felt ideologies and positions on issues that are actually kind of minority moral positions in the community, you would expect that to be a pretty prevalent problem, right? It's extremely hard to document to any degree. Andy's cautions are all astute, but I do think that you witness something kind of interesting and telling in the school board meetings where the kind of the book bans come up, right? Whereas on the one hand, you have this kind of elite opinion that all book bans are bad, that all book bans are harking back to Nazi Germany, and that this is, the incipient rise of fascism that is promoting this parental movement about it. But then you watch the videos and you listen to the parents reading these comments, and you see the school board members refusing to allow the parents to read these comments, and yet standing by these books and maintaining that they're appropriate nonetheless. That's something we kind of seen many times. As Andy suggested, there are fewer book bans that are occurring than are widely posited, largely because the definition of ban has been expanded to include being temporarily removed from a shelf upon review and then put back after. And I think probably, I might be wrong about this, but I think the majority moral intuition in reading some of these passages would be unease towards a hard no that this does not belong in a school library. And yet, for the most part, books that contain, in my opinion, egregiously pornographic material are still allowed in. And that's not, I think, a judgment that the community would come to. And I think there's a strong disconnect that you see in those board meetings between the community and the board members. And I think that disconnect is rooted in the board members being kind of having a higher allegiance to the prevalent elite opinion than to the moral intuitions of the people who elect them, because those people aren't actually the people who elect them in too many cases.
Scott.
I think I come back to, it really does depend on the local district and the local board, and there's just tremendous variation, even in the same region, let alone in different regions of the country. And I think that ultimately, if there are community members that are seriously upset about a substantive issue, that's going to come out one way or another, either flooding the boardroom and or in the next election. And I think as my fellow colleagues shared, there's no doubt that I think that the average school board election turnout is way too low, and we need to be really thoughtful about ways in which we can improve that and improve representation. But when something really frustrates the community, and when the board is too out of step with the community, I would argue that there are mechanisms in place to correct for that. And we were talking about a little while ago this this concept of opting out of state tests, which is obviously not as much a culture issue, but it was certainly a school policy issue. And in New York State, where I live, 20% of parents chose to have their kids opt out back in 2014 and 15, and lo and behold, by 2016, the policy changed. That was a state level policy, not a local policy, but there was just a groundswell of parental discontent against an idea that did come from a smaller number of foundations, academia, different places around tying test scores to teacher evaluations. So I think we have a system where there are checks and balances, but I think it ultimately comes down to the makeup of the board and where they're getting their information from, and everybody gets their information from a slightly different place.
Yeah, that last point's key. Because I like the typology that Max lays out of sort of how this happens and the issues he's concerned about. You can flip that around and you can find boards that have gone the other way, and where you have people who say, well, our views are not being respected and reflected here. Like it's an issue. People tend to approach it, particularly in this polarized time, from whatever their own priors are, but it's an issue of sometimes these institutions get captured and they do things, and then is the institution robust enough, and are the processes around it robust enough politically to have some sort of a corrective? And with some of this current stuff, we're living right through it, so we won't know. We'll know in a couple of years. Like, do people decide, oh yeah, you elected a board and they banned a bunch of books, and the quiet majority that has unease with that is gonna speak up, or are the structures, once you get control of one of these boards, it is different? We'll find out. And I think right now, every time there's an election, you get a bunch of people who want to like extrapolate from it and be like, this is the new, like, culture war issues don't work, or culture war issues are what's going to get everybody elected to boards, or this, that. You can't tell, and these things they are way too varied, particularly like these last couple of cycles we've been through.
And if I could just make one more quick point, that I think there's also a protection built into the system, that an individual board member in and of themselves doesn't have power to change things. It takes the whole board. It takes a vote of the board. The board speaks as a whole. And so there is sort of that built-in protection mechanism of having debate at the board table, because not everybody's always going to think of the same way. And then secondly, between the legal construct in various states of education law and the sharing of state and local power, there are many seats at the table to ensure that no laws are broken, and that ultimately the local communities aren't overstepping into state issues, and vice versa.
I want to ask the panelists about two themes that have come up, which are, one, on the one hand, we hear a lot about prevalence. I'm inclined to agree that the ecosystem we're in media-wise exacerbates that, but I would sort of also ask, how do we know? It seems like all of the self-interested actors have an interest here in relying on anecdote, but are any organizations actually in a position to collect rigorous data on this? It certainly doesn't seem that government or any sort of independent groups have come in and been able to, it oftentimes hinges on activist groups having to file FOIA requests, which can be a waste of time for districts. But on the other hand, leaves researchers and people who want to sort of like present what's the data on these clashes kind of helpless and reliant on those anecdotes. And the other theme that seems to come in is consensus. I agree. If you look at the public opinion polling, it seems like there's a lot of consensus on these issues around history. I think Andy's on the mark there. But then my question is, in what way are our institutions failing to connect that consensus to sort of like a less culture war driven school board environment where we're focusing on student academic outcomes and rather than these other issues? And so is it on that big middle ground of folks to show up to school board meetings? Are they neglecting their duty, or is there something about our institutions that are just making it really hard for that middle to have the voice that it ought to have on these questions?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. An interesting thing, Max describes this as like we've had this like clear shift. These institutions have been captured. There's been this shift. I see it a little differently. In that deck I put out, one of the things we really saw post 2020 was an absolute explosion in DEI initiatives in the corporate sphere, in the government sphere, in schools. And I mean, if you look at the scale of it, I think a reasonable person would look at that and say, how could you possibly have expanded that much, where you see like the leading providers with, 100, 200% increases? How could you have done that with any kind of fidelity to quality? And so I think that's like, when I look at Virginia, I mean, there's some policies that I think people are understandably frustrated about around, admissions to selective schools and so forth. But a lot of what has animated the debate isn't stuff that's actually come in any formal way through the institutions. It's people freelancing. It's teachers who are told, hey, you should teach about this. And they go find something on Pinterest and they, and again, you don't hear about the ones that go well, but you sure hear about the one where they tell parents in a heavy military community that if you're in the military, you're really privileged. Like that one we're going to hear about because that understandably outrages parents. Or like clumsy sort of political typologies by race and ethnicity. That was another one that went around recently. So I think it's I think it's less like that. There's just a lot of clumsiness, and the institutions aren't responding that way. And one of the reasons, and again, I will own my bias towards the Virginia standards, is we said, look, you got to teach about this stuff. You got to teach about it rigorously, and we're going to provide the support for you to do that. And we're going to actually lean into that rather than letting 1,000 flowers bloom. Some of those blooms, which are going to be, given the state of teacher prep and everything else, are going to be problems. And I think that may be a place that we need to go. It's about how do you actually do this stuff with fidelity and rigorous ways rather than leaving it. There was more to your question. I don't want to monopolize, but that was one part of it that sort of stuck with me.
Yeah, I'll
Go ahead, Max.
add a few comments to that. I mean, as you indicated, Michael, there really is kind of next to no reliable data on this question whatsoever. And part of the question is, well, look, like what kind of data could there be? And the only two halfway convincing data points that I've seen, I've seen nothing outside of what Andy said about the general explosion of DEI in and around education. But the other two data points that have struck me are the PEN America, quote unquote, banned book series, and also the Parents Defending Education tracking of policies with respect to kind of gender identity and parental information and consent. And on the former, this is maybe a heterodox opinion, but there's actually dramatically less book banning than my thesis would give me to expect in the country. Only about 1% of school districts, according to PEN America, have seen book challenges. About 75% of them fail. Given what one can perceive to be as a flood of kind of new types of authors, new types of materials coming into schools, one would expect a broader reaction to that than 1% of school districts with a 75% fail rate. On the other hand, what Parents Defending Education has documented, which I think is just worth repeating, is that about 1/5 of American students currently go to school in a school where the policy is that they can be treated as the opposite sex. They can all have all their students be kind of forced to treat them as opposite sex without their parents being informed about it. This is just a dramatic shift in how schools conceive of the parent-child bond. It's a dramatic shift in terms of what kind of message the school sends to children as to the nature of man and the nature of truth. And it has happened very quickly in a very widespread way, in a way that suggests that maybe there is something far stronger afoot than just kind of what we're seeing in the media, because this is another thing where it was not even documented until one group, which is an activist organization, took the FOIA requests, took the kind of the manual scrape of it to demonstrate that something really dramatically new has happened in a very short time period with respect to the gender issue.
But I think that sort of speaks a little bit to how we should be analytically thinking about this. The reason we're at a high number like 20% is because this tends to be happening in larger cities, larger school divisions, which not coincidentally happen to be centers of media and culture life in the United States. So like this is 20% of kids and 20% of school districts. Which one are we talking about?
20% of kids.
20% of kids. And that's because there's that's not 20% of school districts. That's my point. That's 20% of kids because they tend to be in these large, they're aggregated, these larger. So we should just I'm not arguing on either on the merits or disputing the statistic. I'm just saying when you think about a system with 13,000 school districts, many of which are, the median size is like 3,000 kids, you have to think about that in context in terms of where these things are happening, particularly just to say it in a country where there is a California and a New York is going to obviously, have an impact on that. And so this gets to how much is this happening? And if I'm parents defending education, I'm going to tout that. That's a great fundraising strategy. But if I'm a parent in many parts of the country, how meaningful is that actually to my experience?
So I like this.
That'll be all over Twitter, obviously, and everybody will love to fight about it. One data point, and actually I'm going to answer, it's a single data point, but since this is education, a single data point, like basically an RCT. That is the Washington Post, Michael, they have a conflict beat now. It is kind of astounding to me. They have actually put reporters on just covering conflicts in education, which seems really weird given that all this other stuff happens. We had this pretty important study on the effect of curriculum on learning that was actually a controlled experiment, got zero coverage, right? And yet we have a conflict beat. And so I think that does, to your question, that is a data point in terms of how much is this driving. It seems very weird that a powerful legacy newspaper would decide that they're going to cover education through the lens of conflict. That I thought was not a great, it's an anecdote, but I don't think it's a particularly positive data point for us.
So Andy, let me just jump in here and talk about the 5% number. The 5% has been a number that's been mentioned more than once in the conversation so far. And 5% sounds like it isn't very much. But when you realize that lots of people are not engaged, they're sitting back, they're watching, they're taking care of their families, they've got their jobs to do, they're just not going to be engaged. 5% can be quite a presence. And so 5% of the population tends to participate in school board elections unless there's an explosion out there when it can, as Scott mentions, it can blow up on you. But 5% is about what participate in primary elections. And so you can have presidential primaries where if you can get 5% of the vote, you can have a huge impact on who is going to be your next presidential nominee. So maybe one of the reasons we're seeing so much of this cultural conflict within the context of school boards is that what's happening in school boards is really going to be related to what's going to be happening in presidential and senatorial primaries, and big politics is going to be affected by the little politics of school boards. So to what extent is this just a playing field for the big time?
I think it's both ways, actually. I think it runs, I don't disagree with what you're saying, Paul. I think it also runs the other way, though, where people who are now on these school boards and so forth, some of them and some of the activists, they have a taste for the theater and they want to bring these big national debates down into their community. So I think we're seeing it actually run in both directions, where you're seeing a nationalization of issues because that's what people are talking about in some ways that are at odds with look, and I'll say during the standards process in Virginia, we had people coming and commenting, and they weren't even commenting basically on things that were in the standards. They were just making they wanted to tie us into broader political points. So I don't disagree. I think it runs both ways. And I do think we should have a conversation about, it makes no sense that we don't have school board elections aligned to normal primary and election schedules. That's obviously that exists for reasons that I would argue kind of get in the way of democracy. We should also think about just how the meetings operate. to your point on the 5%, the small margins, it's also, if you have these board meetings and a lot of them, like they don't even start doing the dirty stuff till really late at night, like that's not transparent. They do that after the meeting, everyone's left. That's very difficult for most people in a community to participate in. So we should also be thinking about like, what do you do to make these meetings more accessible, more transparent, more democratic? I think there's like a number of structural reforms that we should be
Okay,
thinking
so
about to
good.
get it.
Scott,
I
did
think
you-
you're driving at, Paul, which is this
Yeah.
factionalism problem
Good,
that
good.
we have.
Good. Scott, did you want to get in on this?
That'd be great. So a few thoughts. The first is that we have to remember one interesting thing about school boards versus other types of boards of other institutions, whether that's university boards or hospital boards or corporate boards. They have to comply with open meetings law. There's a public comment period. These are different mechanisms. And so I think one of the reasons why this is always in the news and why you hear the bubbling up of these culture issues more maybe in K-12 boardrooms than you do in some other parts of American society is simply because there's a camera rolling in every school board meeting, and any clip could end up being seen by 2-3 million people in a very compressed time frame. That wasn't the case, obviously, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And it's not the case with the way most boards work. I fully support the open meeting laws because I think transparency is the most important goal, but it does come at that interesting conundrum that you start to nationalize these local issues and you don't get the full picture because it's a clip, and so there are issues with that. I want to come back to the question that you asked about the middle, and do school boards represent the full spectrum of Americans, or are they taken over one way or the other? And I would say that, look, school boards, of course, they're political bodies like any other part of our government, but I would say that our system in most states, at least in terms of the way school board members get elected, is less political than at different levels of government, namely, state government or certainly our federal government, where at this point, if you live in a very red or very blue state, the primary process is actually more influential in terms of the outcome of the election than the general election process. And so in that kind of a system, it disenfranchises a large portion of like the political body. At least the way it works in New York is we do not, affiliate with political parties, and we do not have primaries. And so the voter, albeit sometimes the turnout rate is woefully low, but the voter does have sort of full choice of anybody who's running. And there's no sort of sorting or primary process that took place first by an even smaller number of voters to reduce down the choices. And so I think in that respect, I think that's a good thing. I think the timing of elections, that's a debate in and of itself. And I think that the more research that can be done and the more data we can accumulate is helpful in trying to guide us.
Paul, should time for one more question, or we're coming up on the.
Yeah, you want to pose the last question, Michael?
Absolutely. So, there was an event I'm sure that some of our listeners today saw yesterday or the other day in Montgomery County, Maryland, where you had some members of the Muslim religious community coming out, and there was a big debate around, one of these issues with how to teach about gender identity in the classroom. I want to ask the panelists whether they think one area where maybe boards could help diffuse some of this is by treating these culture war issues differently at the elementary level than at the high school level. Scott had brought up the point earlier about, fights over which version of the Bible were taught, hundreds of years ago, and that caused such issues. Well, we solved that issue by deciding that we weren't going to teach religious indoctrination in schools, and the swords were put down in one sense there. Is there any opportunity to do that here, where you say maybe at the higher grades you have to do sex education, so you're going to grapple with these issues, but at the lower level we see a lot of consensus and think that maybe things ought to operate differently? Is that a way that we can maybe circumvent some of these challenges?
Okay, 30 seconds to each.
Yeah, I'd answer that differently. Like the Bible Wars quieted down because we created Catholic schools. Like there wasn't a resolution to that, and that's why a lot of that violence ended. I think like two things. One, I think this is all being cast in the national media very much in black-white terms, and what you actually see on the ground is much more multicultural coalitions around a lot of this than people realize. And I think we need to be attentive to that. And second, for the point of the Catholics deciding they need to start their own schools, I do think some of this like, and I'll just use an example I've written about before. If you are not comfortable that your kid's teacher is gonna have a picture on their desk with their same-sex partner, if that makes you uncomfortable, you probably can't be in the public schools. And if you think it's really important that we teach kindergartners about gender theory, you may not be able to operate in the public schools either. We need to figure out these are pluralistic institutions. That's the conversation that we need to have. And I think there's some people on both sides who some of the things they want are probably incompatible with operating in a pluralistic place in the public square.
Good, Max. Quick response.
Yeah, I wish that the answer to Michael's question were yes, obviously, insofar as it does seem as though the public opinion does come down at a point where almost everybody agrees this is inappropriate for elementary, and then there's more of a consensus that it's fine to present to middle and high. But I think that the logic of this issue militates against that being a solution that school districts will be comfortable with, because it either is true and therefore should be taught to all ages, especially the younger ages, because it's an extraordinarily formative time and a time that students absolutely must feel comfortable, or it's not true and it should not be taught because schools should not promote falsehoods. I think that this issue is too black and white in its substance to lend itself towards a steady, stable, democratic compromise at scale.
And Scott, you get the last.
I think if you look at any content area that's taught in school, I mean, there are differences in the way in which it's taught in kindergarten versus 12th grade. Think about, they're not teaching calculus or Shakespeare to kindergartners. At the end of the day, there are differences. And so I think with anything that's taught, and that's what educators, hopefully bring to the table, is their expertise in trying to make issues age appropriate. Understand there's going to be disagreements about that. That all has to be, adjudicated, but certainly that concept makes.
Well, thank you all panelists. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Andy. And thank you, Michael Hartney, for co-moderating. And thank you all in our listening audience for participating in our seminar today. Our last seminar in the conference will happen 1 week from today at noon Eastern time. And we will be discussing, if not school boards, then what? What alternatives are there for school governance? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.